Good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us this morning and welcome to Colorado Conversations. Our state faces an acute housing crisis, which has led to skyrocketing home prices and rents. State policymakers and advocates, of course, have vowed to tackle this crisis. And this morning, we will talk about some of the proposed solutions and where we're headed. But first, please welcome Vince Bisdek, the editor-in-chief for the Gazette family of newspapers. Vince?
Thank you very much, Luigi. Colorado Politics and the Denver Gazette are excited to host this morning's forum. As Luigi noted, the housing challenge in Colorado is acute. Consider this, a $300,000 home in 2015 is now worth $550,000, an increase of more than 80%. That means an additional $1,142 a month. In contrast, the average wages only increased by 29.6% over that same time period. So we hope that this morning's forum will offer insight into this problem and potential solutions as well. So thank you, and back to you, Luigi.
Thank you, Vince. Appreciate that. We have a great panel this morning. Joining us is Peter Lifeari, who is the executive director of, and Peter, correct me if I'm wrong, Maker, is that how you pronounce it?
Thanks, Luigi. Maker. One of our makers say makers make moves.
Perfect. Thank you for that. Maker Housing Partners, and of course, Peter is also the Common Sense Institute 2021 Terry J. Stevenson Fellow. As one of more than 3,000 housing authorities across the country, Maker is a developer of affordable housing communities in Adams County and collaborates with other housing authorities to create attainable and sustainable housing and, of course, communities for vulnerable families and individuals. Peter currently serves on the board of directors for Indy Dwell in support of its mission to revolutionize the building industry by producing dwellings that improve occupant health and well-being, as well as the health of the environment, and of course, empower our communities as well. He also serves as regional president of Mountain Plains NAHRO and chairs the Adams County COVID-19 Housing Response and Recovery Task Force. Peter, thank you for joining us this morning.
Thank you, Luigi.
Also joining us is Karen Kahlenberg, who is the executive director for Habitat for Humanity of Colorado. She came to the organization via Habitat for Humanity International, where she worked for 10 years and developed programs for campus chapters, provided consultation, training, and support to affiliates across the country. While there, she also coordinated the 2003 Jimmy Carter Work Project and helped to organize the 2008 Home Builders Blitz. She has led 5 global village trips to build homes around the world. Karen also holds a bachelor's degree from the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, and a master's of arts in nonprofit management from Regis University, where she was inducted into the Jesuit National Honor Society. Karen, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me. Good morning, everyone.
Also joining us is Steve Lady, who serves as the Chief Executive Officer for the Colorado Association of Home Builders and the HBA of Metro Denver. He has been with the association since November 2017 and the HBA of Metro Denver since December of 2020. Previously, he served as Vice President of Government Affairs for the Colorado Association of Realtors, where he directed the public affairs efforts of the association. He has also held the positions of Director of Government Affairs and Public Policy Manager for the Colorado Association of Realtors. Ted has served as an aide to members of both the General Assembly, our General Assembly, and the United States House of Representatives. He holds both undergraduate and graduate degrees from the University of Colorado in Political Science and Public Administration. Ted, thank you for joining us.
Great to be with you, Luigi. Thank you for having me. Good morning, everyone.
Also joining us this morning is Elizabeth Apetz, who served as the Vice President of Government Affairs for the Colorado Association of Realtors. She has been with the group since January 2016. She directs the public policy efforts of the association and manages many functions of the Government Affairs Division. She really specializes in policy development, advocacy, and legislative affairs. She also oversees the association's Legislative Policy Committee and candidate endorsement process through the Colorado Association of Realtors Political Action Committee. A licensed attorney in 3 states, Liz has more than 14 years of experience in government affairs and legal analysis in DC, as well as in Colorado. She also served as a U.S. congressional staffer. Liz holds a BA in International Affairs from CU Boulder and a JD from Creighton University. Liz, thank you for joining us this morning.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks for having me.
Finally joining us also is Jonathan Kapili, who serves as Executive Director of Neighborhood Development Collaborative, a coalition of 19 Metro Denver nonprofit affordable housing organizations. Jonathan is also founder of Kapili Consulting. He's an experienced urban planning, real estate, and community development professional. He previously worked at the Urban Land Conservancy, where he helped to lead real estate acquisition and redevelopment projects, as well as building capacity and engagement, of course, in the West neighborhood of Denver. He has also coordinated with various national and regional housing policy initiatives. Jonathan holds an MA in urban planning from the University of Colorado and a BA in political and environmental science from St. Olaf College. He also serves on the boards of the House of Housing Colorado, All in Denver, Mile High Connects, and on the Affordable Housing Committee of the Urban Land Institute of Colorado. Jonathan, thank you for joining us this morning.
Thank you, Luigi.
As I mentioned, we have an acute crisis. And so the central question is, how can the state, local governments, communities, and of course others, really facilitate the building of more houses so that we can accommodate the kind of growth that we want for our state? Just want to mention a couple of things. These are data from the Common Sense Institute. For example, prices of homes in the Denver metro area increased by 70% since 2015. That's 11 points higher than the US average. Data from the Colorado Association of Realtors Affordability Index shows our state's affordability declining by more than 45% for single family homes and more than 43% for townhouses or condos. And in Denver alone, affordability declined by 50% and 55.6%. respectively. One more data point. The average rent in the same time period increased by $317, that's 29% in Colorado, and $469, that's 36% in the Denver metro area. And by contrast, of course, as Vince mentioned, wages rose by 25.3% in the state and 29.6% in the metro Denver area. So I want to go to Liz. Liz, tell us what the landscape is today. What's happening right now with our housing situation?
Well, as you started to describe, Luigi, the inventory is devastatingly low. In our 7-county metro area, there were just 1,486 single-family homes and 452 townhomes available as active listings. That's down 50% and 71% from a year ago. When we look at Denver, the market's even worse, and that accentuates the housing price. So between January and February of just this year, the prices in Denver jumped from $575,000 to $659,000. That's an increase of $84,000 in just 30 days. When we look statewide, it's also bad.
I'm sorry, Liz, I'm sorry, did you say $84,000 in just a month?
Yep. Just January to February of this year. And it's not just a Front Range problem, it's also a statewide problem. When we looked at the median price statewide, the median price is now $555,000, which is a $90,000 increase over last year for single family and $402,000 for the townhome condo market. And that's up $17,000 from last year. And I also want to give you a mountain resort example since we're looking statewide. Last February, a single family home in Lake County was $301,000. In this year, the average single family home price is $546,167. That's an 81% increase. In Summit County, the average price of a home is now $2.56 million. To put that in perspective, your down payment is $513,000. And to finance it at 3.5%, which we're already over those rates for mortgages for 30 years, the monthly payment's $9,000. So you can see we have a really extreme affordability problem because we have no inventory and the prices keep going up.
Thank you for that broad overview of what's happening. Peter, what's driving these skyrocketing prices?
Yeah, thanks, Luigi. First and foremost, Colorado is an amazing place to live. We have a robust economy. We have very welcoming communities with services and amenities and opportunities and fantastic Main Street small businesses and a diversified economy. And so we're a thought hub and people are attracted to our great state to make their lives, as well as the convergence of the millennial generation moving robustly into housing acquisition behaviors in ways that we were not quite anticipating or believing perhaps there was some generational shift. And so coupling net in migration with patterns that were exasperated by the pandemic, here we are, right? And so this is something that we are in the upper quintile of pain in this regard when it comes to our housing supply crisis and the unaffordability dynamic. And this is having a tremendous downward pressure on our extremely low-income Coloradans who are already struggling to be able to meet basic needs and stave off housing burdensomness, eviction, and homelessness. Thanks, Luigi.
Hey, when you say there was a sort of a perception that they may be a generational thing, for lack of a better phrase, going on. I mean, you're meaning to say that millennials supposedly were not really looking to buy homes, right? They were looking to, they value experience more than, owning properties, for example. But, and correct me if I'm wrong, what's happening is, of course, they're now getting married, they now have young children, and then they're realizing, yeah, they need a home. Is that what's happening, Peter?
Yeah, absolutely correctly. Millennials, just like every other generation, want a beautiful place to create their family and their legacies, and as well as the fact that there's some economic pressures here too. Carrying more student debt has pushed home ownership further out in millennials' lifetimes. And so these convergence of factors, as well as fear of missing out, right? So now we've had panic buying, which we've seen throughout history, which can create these mass movements of rapid price increases. So all of those elements, and the fact that we've come out of about 20 years of suppressed building starts, new homes have not been built at the level, we're not building starter homes anymore. All of these factors have converged, and here we are today.
Thanks for that. Jonathan, how has this housing situation affected the communities, the individuals that you serve?
Thanks, Luigi. Well, it's really having effects across the state and affecting folks differently depending where you live. But we've had a housing market that has been sort of shrinking to serve a small and smaller sliver of high income populations, and that has resulted in housing availability being extremely low and constrained. It results in incredibly high commute times for folks who can't afford to live near where they work, living in substandard housing because that's all they can afford. It has it constricts, to some of Elizabeth's points earlier, the percentage of the population of renters that would want to become homeowners in an ideal world and is ready, millennials, like Peter said, that are kind of stuck where they are. That also has a downward effect then on the rest of the market, because folks aren't moving through the market to free up space for other renters who do just want to rent. So it's affecting people's livelihoods, their health, their wealth, their well-being. I saw someone in the chat mention something about children and the effect that this has on students. We're seeing a lot of folks in gentrifying communities who are essentially, being forced out because they can't afford housing costs anymore, having to move. And there's a lot of research that shows every time you move your kids around in schools, they get behind, significantly. And there are definitely schools in lower income neighborhoods in Metro Denver that are sort of hemorrhaging students, and that affects both the schools, but also educational outcomes for kids. So a plethora of negative consequences.
Karen, I guess the same question to you, ma'am. What does this mean for your efforts to help, vulnerable families, individuals, in the course of trying to provide them with, not substandard housing?
Well, I think, Luigi, we have a huge issue with workforce housing. I think, you know, in order to be able to first recruit good employees, we need to have affordable rental stock. In order to retain them, we need to have home ownership opportunities. And when you look at who many of our organizations on this panel, as well as I recognize so many names in terms of the attendees, you know, we're looking at the fact that our teachers can no longer afford to live in the communities they're serving, nurses, government employees. And so I think, you know, it is impacting both the individuals themselves in terms of being able to thrive as a household, but it's also impacting Colorado in general. To have really thriving communities, we need to be able to live and work in the communities that we're serving. And so I think it's just this greater ripple effect that we are now seeing.
Ted, your industry is, it is upon you to try and provide the kind of housing inventory that would adequately poise us for a flourishing future. What is happening? And I guess let me refine the question. What is preventing home builders from building the kind of inventory that we need?
Thanks, Luigi. Well, there's a number of factors. We talk about the 4 L's, and there's really a 5th L in Colorado of construction, and those construction cost drivers and the challenges that any market presents. And all of them are challenges right now. So you've got lumber, right? It's still up above $1,200 per 1,000 board feet. We had it as high as 1,600, even higher than that. And it just really spiked as the pandemic hit, as mills closed or reduced production. Land, thankfully, we're hopefully going to see some lot availability widen, but we saw a very huge contraction in the amount of land, developable land, as well as the time that it takes to entitle, say, a raw piece of dirt and be able to build vertically and then ultimately into a new community and provide more housing. Loans, we've just talked about it. Somebody, I think Liz just mentioned that. We're seeing interest rates creep up. Thankfully, we've had very historically low interest rates, and that's probably one of the things that's kept the demand where it is. Labor, though, is our biggest. But really quick, let me back up. Besides lumber, 10 of the largest inputs into a home, materials inputs into a home, were up over 30% or more in 2021 alone. And they started to creep up in 20, and they look like they're going to remain pretty high for the remainder of 2022. But labor is really the big issue here. We've been undersupplied in labor and skilled labor for many, many years. Peter, somebody talked about not keeping up coming out of the recession. That was one of the biggest reasons we could not. We just lacked the skilled labor. I think the average age right now of some of our skilled trades, 46. We need to do a better job of getting more and more kids, younger kids, people that are looking for career changes engaged into the trades. It used to be that these trades were considered very valuable contributors to society. They always have been. The reason that they haven't been lately, I think, is because we've been a little too centered or focused that every kid needs to have a college education. I did. I'm glad that I did, but it's not for everyone. And folks can really earn a really great living, own their own business, and really prosper in life. So those have been huge challenges for the industry and the ability of the men and women in the construction industry to meet demand.
So let me ask you a follow-up question on labor shortage, because obviously sure. Colorado is not the only state that's experiencing this problem. And I was from Arizona. I spent 16 years over there. The construction labor shortage over there is probably just as acute as we have over here. How do you begin to solve a problem that is not only endemic in the state, but it's endemic, across the country?
Yeah, it takes time, Luigi. We're doing, we've started with our friends in the commercial space, Associated General Contractors, Careers in Construction Colorado. Really, in its most simplistic form, we're bringing shop class back to high schools. we're opening up those horizons for kids to understand, here's how I learned these skills, and here's the promise that these skills will lead to in a career. That takes time, though. You also need immigration reform. We need more foreign labor. So it's not one issue, or it's not one solution, just like this housing conundrum that we're in. It's going to take multiple kind of workforce efforts, funding from the state, funding from the federal government, but really getting kids to understand, veterans returning home, those that have been incarcerated, that they have opportunities. And I mean, wages have never been better in the skilled trades right now. They're above $30 an hour, and you can be making $72,000, $75,000 coming out of an apprenticeship annually right now.
I'm sorry, did you say between $72,000 and $75,000 coming out of an apprenticeship program?
Right, coming out of an apprenticeship program. So especially in the mechanical space, HVAC and all that. So the opportunities are out there. We just need to help together make them known to the next generation. But we are losing a lot of good skilled labor. We lost a lot in the recession that had marketable skills to go into, say, oil and gas or manufacturing or other industries, and we have not gotten them back.
Thank you for that. To our viewers and our listeners, I do encourage you to ask questions, either key them in through the Q&A box or the chat box, and we'll try to get to as many of them toward the end of the program. Peter, a couple of days ago when we spoke, you mentioned the idea of embracing regionalism. And I think the impetus for that is that there might be multiple levels of rules and a fractured approach to housing that's inhibiting our ability to build more. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, thanks, Luigi. I think we're going to talk some of the historic efforts happening currently at the General Assembly, and one of them is the Innovative Housing Incentive Program, which correlates to this. Right now we're struggling with a disaggregated, project-specific regulatory environment, meaning home rule, local control serves Coloradans extremely well in many ways. But because of the fragmented nature of our housing market, we're struggling to create a consistent, predictable, and risk contained approval market, right? So to the process of getting a building permit. And so we have really limited economies of scale. And so we have a lot of pent up innovation that is struggling to take hold, as well as a lack of competition. And so, over 40% of all new homes built in America last year were built by 10 companies. And so, how can we unleash the creativity and entrepreneurship of our Colorado businesses so that we can attack the cost and problems together? And so one of the ways we could look at doing this is through regional collaboratives to create use by right housing, zoning and entitlement methodologies, where we have we have consortiums already amongst local governments that are highly successful, where they share expertise and knowledge and try to gain efficiencies accordingly. And so the idea would be, is there an opportunity where counties and cities that have shared interests and goals can come together to create a larger market that has shared building codes with slight variations of design standards, and allow ourselves to have a market that can flourish in the way that we have other markets flourishing in America today. And so right now, the opportunity costs are exorbitant. Architects, builders, developers have to recreate each project uniquely in each regulatory environment. We'd like to see that relieved somewhat. And so it doesn't necessarily have to be surgical statewide interventions, although I am a big fan of those and I know they're controversial and I respect those that have concerns with that. But perhaps we have the opportunity to come together where we can create predictability. And my co-fellow and I, we highlighted a step towards that with the Telluride Foundation and their For Sale for Locals program out in the high country, where there starts to become a cadence of predictability and opportunity where developments can span jurisdictions, and we can minimize redundant costs and really try to work towards bringing product to market for Coloradans in radically reduced timeframes.
Liz, if you can break this down for me. Peter mentioned home rule and how that's perhaps prolonging the permitting process, how you're having to replicate or come up with a unique set of approach to each project, and you're having to do that again and again. But so what is the how do you solve a situation like that? What is the potential solution to the problem that Peter described?
Well, Luigi, was that for Liz? Sorry, I missed that.
Yeah,
Liz,
yeah.
yours.
I know we all have such great ideas to contribute, and there's so many great questions going into the chat and the Q&A. I would echo a little bit of what Peter is saying. These regional approaches can be very successful if they're done right. Like, we don't comprehensively think about zoning in a way that is friendly to building your childcare center near your workforce housing, near your access to healthcare, near your amenities and your open space. And what you're seeing is a huge competition between corporate investors and single family folks that want home ownership. In some states, they prohibit what they call wholesaling, which is buying up and going directly to rentals. We haven't considered that yet in Colorado, but the other thing that Peter mentioned is the General Assembly is looking at really innovative ways that we can tackle things comprehensively. And I know we're going to get into some of the state legislation, but some of the strengths of the program, like we did last year with 21-1271, that cuts some of these costs to build right up front, and also prioritizes long-term land use changes that allows governments to be flexible to the needs of their community. Those make a real difference in terms of the upfront costs of matching what the community needs. And the planning grant also allows for a lot of housing assessment needs to make sure it fits the needs of your community. Because the one thing we haven't brought up, but we all talk about, is nimbyism. And in every community, we want to build more to what everyone needs, but we also have to make sure people aren't rejecting those very developments we need to make it more affordable and increase the supply.
Thank you for that. Jonathan, I want to go to you. Liz mentioned nimbyism. How does that translate, and how does that complicate things from your point of view?
Significantly. It is, it's one of those things where every single time you go, into many of these communities with the project, you kind of know what you're going to get, and it's going to be the same sort of recycled talking points. It's like everyone's reading from the same script. I feel really, I care so much about affordable housing. It's really important, but I have some specific issues or questions about this specific project, et cetera, and then it just goes, and then there'll be like 50 of them that sign up to testify and try and keep these from happening. So there's this real disconnect between people's understanding of of what their community needs, and in some cases their individual roles in keeping it from happening, because of a lack of understanding about how important the housing is for their whole community. The folks that are being housed are often the people that they work with or interact with on a daily basis. But there's this disconnect about who's being served, who's being housed, and this almost this boogeyman of what affordable housing is going to do to their community. And as a result, it means that we have testimonies before city council that can last hours, 5 hours, 6 hours, till 10 o'clock or 11 o'clock at night. A lot of vitriol and a lot of pressure on elected officials to shoot down projects that otherwise are exactly what the community needs. There needs to be a lot of education to help people understand why this housing is so important in their communities. And there needs to be a smoother sort of path forward for developers who are trying to meet these needs, to some of what Peter was saying about use by right and things of that nature, so that you can go in and spend a lot of resources, time, energy, assemble financing, and know that at the end of the day, you're going to be able to actually develop the housing that the community is requesting, and not have it lost in a night because of an unfair and biased sort of public hearing.
Thank you for that. Ted, when Jonathan mentioned use by right, what does use by right mean? And the other question I have for you is how long is the permitting process? How long does it take you from, first conceptualizing a project to then getting the permit to actually breaking ground?
I'm going to let Peter answer the use by right here in a minute, or Jonathan, because he speaks more eloquently about it. But it takes, to your question about timing, I think the CSI study from last year pegged it at about a year to entitle, another 6 months or so for site plan review, and another few months for permitting. That's on a good day. That's unfortunately on a good day. We've got local governments that can take up to 3 years to entitle a piece of land. So when you talk about carrying costs with the land already so expensive, one of the things we talked about the panelists the other day is how do we reduce costs? Peter's done a good job of exploring, I think, both with Maker and with his co-fellow, on how do you take that kind of cost of the land out of the equation. Well, one of the ways you could do that, or one of the ways you can reduce the carrying costs of land, is by having a better entitlement process, by allowing property be entitled very quickly, have site plan review done much more expeditiously. Don't change the rules of the game midway through the review process. Don't be on, say level 4 and take us back to level 1 and ask for more comments there. So it takes quite a long time, Luigi, unfortunately. There's a very big parcel up in Westminster that took even more than 3 years just to get the final approvals. They've yet to start to be able to build, or do the horizontal work to even build vertically there. But it's much needed housing for the Westminster area. Peter has, I think, hit on a very interesting, idea about regionalization and being able to have some sort of consistency in the codes that folks are building from. It'd be interesting to see if local governments would cede a little bit of their local control, work together, maybe in a Dr. Cog type fashion, and say, let's have one review process. Let's have one set of codes. Let's stop being HOAs and telling builders what the siding should look like. Let's just go and actually open the doors to the men and women that can do this and bring the much needed housing supply online. I just want to touch on one more thing before you leave, and that's the nimbyism that we talked about, that you asked Jonathan and Liz about, or that was mentioned, you asked Jonathan about. It is so sophisticated now as well. And I put a lot of onus on local government, but local governments are also in a tough spot because, as Jonathan talked about, they go till 10, 11, 12, 1 o'clock in the morning with people lined up saying, yes, I agree that we need more housing. I just don't want it anywhere near where I live. And you got to stop that. That ethic has to change. We've got a branding problem really on housing, and we need to change that.
Peter, just really quickly, what's used by right? And then I want to go to Karen after.
Yeah, and I'll just kind of try to synthesize it. Essentially, it creates a regulatory path with less. Try to put this in Colorado lay terms. Essentially, it creates less regulatory approval processes, because if you meet this type of overlay, right, and these exist in our cities and counties, basically you will have a fast track to approval. There still will be public comments, but ultimately as a developer and as a community member, you have an understanding and an expectation of what the process will be. And it creates that consistency, which unfortunately is lacking. And as said before, this is a problem across the United States. But obviously we care about Colorado. We want to see Colorado thrive. And so use by right will create more predictability, more consistency, which will reduce the amount of time. Time is money, but the public will still comment. And the public will still have influence on what becomes that use by right. And I just would like to share a bit, because, for me, I have a strict no blaming and shaming kind of policy as to how to live my life. And I think that nothing's more concerning than change, right? We deal with it very different. It's very stressful for us. And so of course, Coloradans are going to be concerned about new developments out their kitchen window. And so, when we come back to this, we listen through, we weigh our decision analysis based off of the basic needs and the ability to pursue happiness for all of us. And so we come back to this point and say, you know what, if we care about water conservation, well, then we care about building smaller homes that are highly efficient with greater density. If we care about our public lands and conservation, well, then we're going to want to do more density and infill so that we can keep our pristine Coloradan landscape open and healthy. And so I think these things, folks want these. They're just unclear on the trade-offs and how those trade-offs are going to impact their bottom line and their family. Because coming out of the Great Recession, there was a lot of trauma and pain, and folks remember that, and they want to resist anything that would threaten their well-being and safety. And so if we can move to that point and say, well, how can we create greater consistency and deliver product? I'm seeing a ton of questions in the chat, Luigi, about what is affordability, right? Generally, traditionally, affordability is affordable housing is 60% of area median income for your market area and below, right? Extremely affordable housing is traditionally 50% of area median and below. And we really struggle producing, frankly, 30% of AMI for folks that are traditionally senior and or disabled, right? And so on the other end of that, 80% and above is considered workforce housing. Some call it attainable. We can call it whatever we want, but essentially that's serving to that missing middle that folks may have heard as well. And so one of the ways that we can accomplish this is start to incentivize, right, at the local level or the regional level, as we've discussed, the production of homes at 1,400 square feet or less, which in 1980, when we had abundant housing options that were affordable for sale, as is near and dear to all of our hearts and our panelist, Karen, it's only 9% per Freddie now as of 2019. And this is driven by the decisions we make in our regulatory environment. So if we can attack our condo defect concerns, which traditionally creates units at that 1,400 square feet or less, well, then now we're starting to attack that per square footage that Ted mentioned, the commodity dynamic that's out of our control. So if we have smaller homes that are extremely energy efficient, they're going to be efficient, affordable, and they're going to be desirable, because we're going to have to create product that appeals to the Colorado market. And so this is not, Soviet era block housing with zero differentiation. And most localities have codes and standards that are quite close to one another, but any of those variations add up to replication of action, time, and cost, right? And so can we come together? And I think what we'll see in this regionalism, it's a lot easier to get to than we think. A lot of questions about, well, how will local governments give up control? We're not asking them to give up control. We're asking them to band together, right? Synergize and harmonize what they're already doing, make some of those trade-offs that are in line with our Coloradan values and what we're all discussing on both sides of the dynamic, so that we can come together and deliver product, as Ted mentioned, in radically reduced times. And I'll end, Luigi, and say, all the homes that we admire that were built in the 20s, 30s, 40s, right? Most of them came out, our kit houses, from the Sears and Roebuck catalog. They had duplexes, they had quads, they had cottages, right? And so we're very accustomed to this. And I want to just emphasize that standardization does not diminish the architectural beauty and the quality of our homes. It just allows us to attack this cost challenge that has gotten out of hand.
Thank you for that, Peter. Karen, there are a couple of measures in the state legislature that the proponents are working through them. What for you among these bills, what would you consider to be the most helpful, the most immediate, the legislation that would provide, for lack of a better phrase, the best bang for the buck, if you will?
Sure. Well, actually, it's a really exciting year. There are, I have a list in front of me of close to 20 different pieces of legislation. Our General Assembly is making one of the largest investments due to ARPA funding in terms of affordable housing. And so, you know, we've really been following the funding investments that are around increasing housing stock, which is what we've all been talking about, that there's a need for that. So there is a bill, House Bill 1304, which is going to be providing grant funding to both local governments and nonprofits to help with exactly that, to help increase housing stock. There is also a similar bill, Senate Bill 159, that is creating a revolving loan fund in order to, again, help produce more affordable housing stock. We're really excited, and Peter mentioned the legislation around the Innovation Housing Incentives Program, which is really looking at increasing manufactured housing. I saw a question about that, or factory built housing, whether or not Maker was doing that. Habitat for Humanity, we are across the state. Actually, one of the ways we're looking at increasing our housing production is partnering with some of these, you know, the Fading West, the Simple Homes, Indie Dwell, in order to increase production. It also helps address some of the issues that we talked about in terms of our construction workforce and expediting things and getting things done all under one roof. But those are, I could go on and on. I believe the governor is signing a bill today around the use of local lodging tax revenue, being able to expand that definition and utilize some of that lodging tax in terms of helping with workforce housing. We're looking at this year increasing the amount of tax credits. That has been a really powerful tool for affordable rental developers in order to get more product built. And so making an increased investment in that as well. And I would remiss not to add that there are legislations around mobile home protections, as well as providing funding through grants and loans for mobile home individuals living in mobile homes to help buy properties when they come up for sale. So again, I think, you know, I said this when we all got together earlier, our panel, that we're at such a, you know, it's such a huge housing crisis that there is not one solution. We really need to look at this and come at it from every direction. And I think that there is a lot of creativity that's happening. I do see a comment right now from Senator Zenzinger about the Chaffin missing income bill, and that's another exciting approach in terms of what we were talking about with the being able to provide rental products for the missing middle, those that are making over 80%. So again, I think there will be more to do. I would love in the future to look at some land policy in terms of that seems to be one of our largest costs. So I think that there is the opportunity to just grow, but it's definitely an exciting year in terms of both investments and creative solutions.
Oh, thanks for that, Karen. You know, I started out the conversation in kind of a pessimistic tone, given just how acute this problem is. And now I'm hearing from folks that there are potential solutions that are being worked through. I want to ask Jonathan, of all these bills that are going through the legislature, which one are you watching the most? Which one are you really keen on getting passed?
Well, I think that the HB 1304 and also which is the grant program that Karen mentioned, and then the revolving loan fund are probably going to be some of the most important and powerful bills that will allow nonprofit housing providers to be able to actually, you know, develop housing and have funding for it. To put it in perspective, how much this, you know, what a big impact these bills could have. The state, according to a report it sent out about its spending in 2020, spent about $43 million on affordable housing. It was probably a little bit less each year before that. We're talking about $400 million in combined funds coming through the SLFR, which is essentially ARPA dollars that are coming down to spend on affordable housing. And then those two bills are each $150 million worth. So it's a huge injection of funding that will really help meet local jurisdictions, and it's for nonprofits and for local governments. So it'll really help meet those entities, local governments halfway in their efforts to try and build housing, and also empower, like I said, nonprofits with the tools they need to actually do the development. I also really like the lodging tax bill, which was. I can't remember what that number is, Karen, but you just said it a second ago. But that bill is really interesting because some of the issues that we have right now is that the state, or there's all this growth, right? That our state sort of revolves on, and a lot of it has to do with recreation and things of that nature. There's something called the Mountain Migration Report, which came out, I think, last year, which had a really good breakdown of how in some of these resort communities, 50% of the people who are living there are only living there temporarily. And then there's just so much, so many temporary residents that it's just really swallowing up the housing stock. So when you have a booming economy because of all the people that are coming into it, having the lodging tax, which extracts revenue from that, which originally could only be used to further those basically tourism related expenses. Now it's sort of saying, okay, we're going to internalize the externalities of the impacts of all this tourism, and we're going to let local jurisdictions use those funds to invest in housing and daycare. That kind of mindset, I think, is a really good first step for communities to start thinking about how comprehensively housing factors into every part of their economic growth and other sectors that are, may not on their face seem to be housing related, but are actually overlap significantly. So I'm excited about that bill for what it means for how local jurisdictions might start to think about their growth and how it affects housing. I'm excited for the other two bills because of the ability to actually empower developers to build housing.
Liz, you're closely watching the state legislature, and as these bills go through the process, what are the chances of these proposals actually getting to the governor's office?
Yeah, thanks, Luigi. I think we're all really excited, as Karen was just mentioning, about seeing these bills look at the entire housing continuum. That gives them a better likelihood of success when we're addressing everyone from supportive rapid rehousing to rental to home ownership. We need everyone to be able to move along that continuum in our state. And so if we see legislation that puts that comprehensively together, it gives us that opportunity to invest in the future for what every community needs statewide. Some of the amendments that went through last week on 1282 and 1304 are so critical because they have higher AMI for some of our rural resort community, but lower AMI needs for urban core who may have more low to middle income needs. And I think if we see comprehensive approaches like that, we're going to have a lot more success getting to the governor's desk. Personally, we have problems with some of the bills that are rent stabilization, rent control, where the state is setting those price controls. Those bills are more controversial, and everyone on this panel may disagree. We don't necessarily think that the state setting the prices makes sense, but what we like in the bills that we think will have better success are the bills that take this comprehensive approach that let communities do what they need to do. And they build on what we saw very high success in last year, 1271. We know from the Department of Local Affairs that the planning grants and the incentive grants are actually creating programs and projects statewide. And that's exciting to see local communities respond. I do think we're going to have to be careful to watch the headwinds of what's going to your ballot box. So there are lots of mentions about what's on your state ballot and can we think about other things? Well, there are 5 statewide ballot measures that could be going through title board, whether they cap property taxes, potentially tie up existing inventory, depending on which version goes forward. There's one that reduces property taxes. There's one that lets locals set property taxes. There's an income tax. There's a luxury tax. All of these things at the ballot box are reacting to our cost of housing, but they're actually going to go to voters before we get to decide if these pieces of legislation can have a real difference. And I think those are the headwinds we're going to have to watch going forward.
Thank you for that. There's what, $400 million in potential housing funds that are going to be injected into the economy. That's a lot of money. And I'm presuming because housing is primarily a problem of funding, it's going to solve a whole lot of problems. But I do want to ask Ted, so you have what, $400 million that people will be able to deploy, but you're still running up against the kinds of problems you had described earlier. The permitting process is long. NIMBYism, unfortunately, is an issue, continues to be an issue. You know, there might be some resistance to the idea of regionalism because that means giving up some level of control. And of course, by nature, human beings are, you know, not as perceptive to the idea of giving up some level of control. So I want to ask your thoughts. Okay, so there's a ton of money going into the pipeline. How does that help exactly?
Yeah, good question. So I think, you know, Liz touched on 1271 from last year that she and Karen led the way on and their groups. We were proud to support that one. Same with House Bill 1304, the grants bill Jonathan talked about, and Senate Bill 159, the revolving loan fund. They're allocating money in the right way, in my estimation, right? Especially with the revolving loan fund, you can build off of it, you can create a corpus, it builds off of itself and sustains itself. But what we've done is we provided a lot of tools, if you will, to local governments, to local actors. So now it's incumbent upon them. There's a clarion call for local governments to act. We talked about it earlier. They're under extreme pressure from a lot of constituents that don't want to see more housing or don't understand the need for more housing. But you touched on them, right? We've got to be able to tighten up our timeframes for review and for entitlements, for permitting. So it's, you know, we can only do so much with the money that we may be appropriating this year if these were to pass, and I think that they will. But we've got to make sure that we don't bottleneck it then at the local government approval process. We've got to all work together and help folks understand, change the brand, if you will, of housing and why housing is needed. And we've got to do better. Otherwise, this money won't be deployed in ways that are going to help us really take a bite out of the dearth of housing. What
are you hearing from the local governments? I guess another way of asking the question is, what's preventing the state from actually having this or from embracing this idea of regionalism? You know, what sorts of conversations are you having with local government officials? What are they telling you when you present these ideas to them?
I personally have not presented the regionalism idea. We've had, you know, Peter and his co-fellow really, I think, brought it up in their report from last June to kind of start that conversation. I know that, you know, local control is sacrosanct, and to a large degree, home rule it is really good, serves Coloradans pretty well, but we do have a statewide problem right now. We have a matter of statewide concern, and it is our housing. It's that cost of housing. It's the supply of housing, all obviously interrelated. So maybe the legislature and the municipal league and the counties need to look together and say, how do we do this? How do we give up a little bit? What is the trade-off? What's the proper trade-off? And I agree with Peter. If it's done right, if it's done how it's prescribed in the report, you don't necessarily give up your approval power. You're not giving up your powers. You're just synthesizing with other governments. We do this all the time. We do this on transportation planning. We do this with senior policy for seniors. You know, there's just a regional approach that you have to take on a number of things. Housing shouldn't be any different.
Peter, I want to ask you the same question. What are you hearing from local governments whenever you present these ideas to them? What's the how would you describe their resistance to it? If, you know, and to what extent is that resistance present? And is this idea of regionalism, how feasible is it really?
I think with each passing day, it's becoming more feasible. There's a tremendous amount of curiosity that I'm receiving, and my co-fellow and I did an embrace of the idea. And then, you know, like the calculus, okay, is this technically correct, right? Do we have the capacity to do this? And then, okay, what's the political dynamic, right? You know, as elected officials, you know, we're serving our communities because we love our communities and we love the people that live there. And so there's that duty, you know, folks feel duty bound to their constituents, right? And so the question we get a lot is, well, how is our community going to respond to this? There's already such tremendous fear, anger, concern, you name it. And so how do I balance that, right? And so we're in that process now. And I think that we're gathering a community of discussion around this, like today, and I'm seeing a greater propensity for action. We just had, you know, Crested Butte announced an emergency last year. You know, this is something where we look at it and we say, okay, it's very reasonable to feel comfortable in the status quo. It's all we know, right? And so this is brand new. Or at least it is rare. And so lacking empirical evidence because we don't have an example to benchmark against has been a concern. What we're seeing is as the market, and it moves with brutal efficiency, continues, so short-term rentals there, the concern about institutional buyers, the innovation happening in the market is starting to require us to consider these non-traditional methodologies. And so what I'd say, Luigi, is I think we're getting a lot closer. And I think that the idea of not saying that we have to have a statewide intervention, but we can do this through a regional approach, that use that as the evidence base to then present to Coloradans why this hypothesis is true and accurate, is what we're in the midst of currently.
Thank you. I want to go to some of our audience questions. There's a ton of them. And thank you again to our viewers and listeners for spending the morning with us and being so engaged and having these conversations. I think this might be a question for Peter. It's from AJ. Government has incentivized green products. Why can't we incentivize builders to construct single family housing that is below the market median sales price? So I guess incentivizing via tax credits might be one, grants, etc. But Peter, Ted, you want to take this?
Sorry, I was on mute. So the question, sorry, Luigi, is why can't we incentivize builders to build at below market rates?
Yes. Yeah.
I think part of it is all the cost challenges that I talked about. You've got to be able to minimize the costs in some way or another. Peter and I have talked a lot offline, and it was again in that CSI report. If you haven't read it, I would encourage people to read it from last June. How do we take away some of the costs, like on land? Can you work with local governments or the state government that has a surplus of land, and can we take kind of that cost out of the equation? But it's just difficult. It's difficult to be able to take a raw piece of dirt that is becoming much more expensive, taking a lot more time to entitle, with increasing costs for labor and for materials, and then say, now I can build this at 80% or 60% AMI. I just can't without some severe, infusion of whether it's subsidization or something, taking one of those cost pressures or really multiple cost pressures away to be able to do that. So it's really difficult right now, Luigi.
Thank you for that, Ted. And maybe a question for Liz or maybe for Karen. Here's a question from Jenny. If we can't build our way out of this, at least in the short term, how do you stabilize rents given the surge in investors in buying up rental homes? The idea, of course, is to allow regular people to be able to afford to live in the communities where they work or serve.
Yeah, I can start, and then Karen can maybe fill in. One of the things that we passed last year, but is gaining steam across the country, is rent to own and sort of credit building. So you're essentially building your credit as you rent. And if we thought more comprehensively about building a rental where then you can graduate to home ownership, maybe downsize back, or even thought about how we create this mixed property so that we give people the ability to move, I think that is a scenario we need to do a lot more of in our state, because if you are stuck in deed restricted housing, it's great and it's affordable for a little bit until you want to make your move, and then you have no equity. And so we need to be innovative in making sure we're addressing the whole continuum. And I think that'll help.
Karen?
You know, I would just agree. I think investing in the entire housing continuum will help with that. Yeah, and I would maybe ask Jonathan to add a little bit more, but I do think, you know, that's one of our greatest needs, is that we can do that. And if we can provide opportunities for mobility within that housing continuum, I think that is essential as well.
Jonathan, you want to add to that, sir? But also just a quick question, and I know we're running out of time. You know, if there are folks who are watching, listening, viewing, trying to figure out, okay, what should they do? What resources are available to them? Which website they should go to? You know, what are the numbers to call for help? Can you provide a bit of guidance as well, insofar as the resources that are available and places where they can go and access those resources?
Luigi, and anyone else feel free to jump into, but sort of the go-tos I usually recommend for folks are Colorado Housing Connects. The website allows you to look through search availability in income restricted housing. CHAFA also has a lot of great programs, especially in home ownership. So that's the Colorado Housing Finance Authority. And if you are having trouble with your housing costs, whether it's in a place you're currently in, then 211 is a good place. It's basically a switchboard to connect you to a variety of different resources. So that's what I would say in a short answer. And then I think the earlier question basically that you asked, Ted, was how do we incentivize developers, right? You know, I like to joke that one way of solving the housing crisis would just be to flatten all the mountains in Colorado. There's about 2,500 square miles that are basically not buildable. No, just kidding. We live here because of the mountains. So since you can't do that, the most valuable resource is land. And so to Ted's point, conveying land whenever governments have access to it is a massive, like a really huge incentive that can sort of court developers to come and build. The other thing to do is, you know, density bonuses. It's really difficult to just have a regular piece of land with the exact same zoning and height, and then convince a market rate developer, pay them enough to keep it affordable, given what they could get if they were to go just and do market rate rents. So it has to be sort of a variety of tactics. And one of them is just partnering with, you know, frankly, nonprofit developers and housing authorities, and basically making a situation so they can come in and do the development that is needed. Because especially when it comes to serving the lowest incomes, it's more than just building housing. It's about having support services and wraparound services to ensure that folks are able to stay in housing and then succeed afterwards. And so there needs to be sort of a comprehensive set of programming. So that's what I'd say.
And with that, I think this is a good time to end. Ted, thank you for your time. Peter, thank you as well. Karen, thank you. Liz, thank you for your time. Jonathan, of course, thank you. And to all our viewers and the listeners, I hope you got something out of this conversation. This is not going to be the last one. We're going to have more of these conversations moving forward, and especially more on housing as well. And with that, I want to say thank you again. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Thanks, guys. Hey, I was going to mention that this will be available on video on denvergazette.com and coloradopolitics.com. And we will do a story about it and try to include some of the links that were put in the chat for people. And I just wondered if you think University of North Carolina is going to beat Duke.
Yes, they are. That was my little cheer earlier during my introduction. Go Heels.
I'm going to say go blue, because that kind of covers everybody.
I'm very diplomatic.
Yeah, there you go.
Thank you, Vince, and thank you again, everybody. Bye for now.
Thanks all.
Appreciate it.
Thanks for the invitation.
Appreciate everybody.